Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Traumatic Stress Wales webinar. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Hilary Thomas and Rhian Jones from HEIW for supporting this event so ably, and also a massive thank you to Emma Smith for coordinating and administering everybody joining us. And it's great to see so many people with us here today, and an increasing number of people actually, which is fantastic. So my role really is to just provide an overview of what traumatic stress Wales is. And I'm going to be doing this collaboratively with Sarah Cosgrove, who leads our public advisory group. So Traumatic Stress Wales is a national initiative, a quality improvement initiative that's funded by Welsh Government. And we've been in existence since April 2020, so around about 18 months, just a little more now. And our aim is to improve the health and well-being of people of all ages living in Wales at risk of or with post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the things that we're very committed to and proud of is that everything we do is co-produced, co-owned and co-delivered by relevant stakeholders, including and especially people with lived experience of PTSD and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I mentioned, Sarah Cosgrove is the chair of our public advisory group. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to say a few words about the public advisory group and the way that they contribute to Traumatic Stress Wales.
So my name is Sarah Cosgrove. I'm the chair of the public advisory group. My role, actually, my background is in public relations and communications. I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, a statistician, a medic. I'm very much a lay person. But I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following a very traumatic event about 9 years ago. And our group, our public advisory group, is made up of people like me, really. About half a dozen of us, we all have received a diagnosis of PTSD from very, very different causes. We're quite a lively bunch, and I think we really give our input and make our views known, and we contribute to every opportunity. And we really are co-producing with Traumatic Stress Wales. We are consulted at every stage, which is fantastic. We meet as a group every couple of months. Obviously, at the moment, that's done virtually, so we use Zoom. And really, I think we all have a similar motivation, that we are keen to avoid the stigma of PTSD, and we're all motivated to sort of work together for the common good, really, and make sure that the treatment is kept relevant, easy to access, easy to understand, jargon-free, that sort of thing. I was involved in the phase 2 trial, which then evolved to RAPID, and was an early user of the intervention Spring, which was developed with and for people with that lived experience of PTSD. And the RAPID trial was a great textbook example, really, of how people like us were involved, and our lived experiences were used to sort of design and manage and indeed set up an advisory group. The sorts of things that we've been involved with then, we've helped to develop patient resources, patient information, websites. We've taken part in research groups to help with the researchers sort of develop their work. We've contributed blogs, we've undertaken filming and press work, and really every opportunity we've been included. Our views have been sought, whether it's how an animation is looking. Several options were presented to us, and we sort of chose the one which we felt was the most accessible, the one which could be adapted for future use for multiple languages and to increase accessibility. It really has been co-production all the way. You hear these terms sort of bandied around, don't you? But it really is not lip service. It's a thread that kind of runs through everything we do, that of co-production and using our lived experiences. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think that we've produced some really meaningful materials, and we've all freely given of our lived experiences so that those resources can be developed with the end user in mind. I know that all of us in our group sort of share the feeling that actually being part of a public advisory group is actually a really empowering experience. When you're diagnosed with PTSD, you can feel like a victim, and being part of this group sort of turns it on its head a little bit, and it helps us in our own recovery. Actually, we are being proactive, we're managing our own condition and making a difference for other people using our own experiences and what we've learned. And I think that's our common motivation, really, to help others to benefit from our experiences and to make it better for the people who are sort of coming after us. It's a great time to be involved with something like this because PTSD has such a profile. It's in popular culture. We use it as an acronym all the time and we understand what it means by and large. And I think we are really starting to break that stigma. I think I'll pause there, and if there are any questions, obviously do type them in the chat. We are very welcoming as a group, and if you know somebody or if you'd like to come and join us, then please do get in touch. Thanks very much.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. That's a brilliant overview, and I think you highlight how the group looks at things that are focused around the service, but also the research side of things as well. And we're very keen that we're developing an evidence-based approach to helping people, affected by traumatic events. So thank you very much for that. So we've spoken a bit about post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I thought it might be helpful just to give a brief overview about what we're actually talking about. So for these conditions, individuals have to be exposed to a traumatic event. Now, that's either through being directly involved, through witnessing, or through hearing about traumatic events in some instances. Individuals then develop specific symptoms, and the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are re-experiencing symptoms in the form of nightmares or flashbacks, typically, avoidance of thinking about the traumatic event or talking about it or reminders of it, and hyperarousal symptoms, so a sense of current threat, mainly through feeling very on edge, hypervigilant, and an increased startle reaction, more jumpy. In ICD-11, the World Health Organization's classification system, there's been a recent introduction of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which a lot of us are very pleased about because we feel that post-traumatic stress disorder is quite limited in terms of covering the full heterogeneity of different presentations of people affected by traumatic events. And these complex post-traumatic stress disorder requires both the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, but also some symptoms known as disturbances in self-organization. So difficulties regulating emotions, negative self-concept, feeling very negatively about oneself, and also disturbed relationships, so difficulties in relationships. And I personally find that very useful as a construct. It helps us to understand people with the more complex phenomena that we often come across. Now, in terms of the traumatic event, the classification systems really say that the traumatic event has to be above a certain threshold to satisfy the criteria for PTSD or complex PTSD, namely that it needs to involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So things like bullying, for example, would not be sufficient to go above that threshold unless one of those factors was involved in that bullying, which clearly that can occur. Now, that's not to say that people aren't very traumatized by other events, but that's just what the definition, the classification is at the moment. There are shortcomings, and I think we all acknowledge that, to having diagnoses, but I also think that there are some positives to it if used sensibly and appropriately. But I think it is really important that we remember that people present in very different ways after a traumatic event, and whatever we do with people must be person-centered, and we need to personalize our approaches. So a lot of us, although we would use diagnoses and classifications, we would also make sure that we develop a personalized formulation in conjunction with the individual that we're working with to try and have a joint understanding to identify appropriate needs and what may be best to try and help that individual with their needs. So how common is it? Well, I mean, for a long time, I've advocated that post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the common conditions that we come across in mental health. I mean, I think it's on a level with things like depression and with anxiety. And in fact, increasingly, research shows that that is true. This is not an uncommon condition, it's a common condition. I mean, this is some work done from the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, which is one of the best epidemiological surveys in the United Kingdom, although it went to England only in the last couple of iterations. These are the 2014 data. The 2021 will be coming to an end shortly. It's done every 7 years. And as you can see, around about a third of the population will report having been exposed to a traumatic event of the nature that I've just described. You can see some peaks here. So women aged 16 to 24, almost twice, they report being almost twice as regularly exposed to such a traumatic event as men of that age. And in fact, perhaps not surprisingly, sexual violence is a major issue in that age group. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, this uses quite a high threshold actually to screen positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. So it requires a score of over 50 on a scale known as the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist. And as you can see, the mean, or if you sort of do a bit of a mathematical calculation, is just around about the 4%. It's just under the 4% rate. So at a point in time, the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder across the population in England, according to a questionnaire measure, is about 4%, which is quite a high level and comparable to a lot of anxiety disorders and depression. The grey bar again shows you this massive increase in 16 to 24-year-old females. So clearly a particularly vulnerable group to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. What we're talking about here is prevalence. So these are people at one point in time who say that they are suffering from the condition. That doesn't take into account people who have had it and have recovered from it. And certainly estimates for that lifetime prevalence are around about 7% in the high quality studies that have been conducted. So thinking of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, this is work that our group at Cardiff University has been involved in the United Kingdom and the United States. And you can see that if you add the blue columns together and the red columns together, we're talking about just over 7% as being the community prevalence using a questionnaire known as the International Trauma Questionnaire, which interestingly is the questionnaire we're adopting for use within Traumatic Stress Wales. As you can see, in both the United States and in the United Kingdom, the complex post-traumatic stress disorder rates are a bit higher than the PTSD rates, in fact, double it in the United Kingdom. So we shouldn't be thinking of complex post-traumatic stress disorder as being rarer than PTSD. In fact, most of the epidemiological research to date suggests that it is commoner. And of course, one possibility is that it may not be commoner in terms of occurring after a traumatic event, but by nature, complex post-traumatic stress disorder tends to be more difficult to treat and tends to last longer than post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's very, very important that for Traumatic Stress Wales, we think of both of these conditions as being common presentations, and when we're developing services to support people, that we develop services that can deal with both of them. So, as I said, Traumatic Stress Wales came into being in April 2020. We have a national hub based within the Welsh Health Specialist Services Committee and Cumtaf, Morgannwg University Health Board. And then we're developing a network of easily accessible, locally based services centered around the people they're trying to help. And we've got fantastic people now appointed in all of the health boards in Wales who are leading on the endeavours locally and linking up with us on a national basis. Our aim is to have streamlined cross-sector care pathways that avoid unnecessary repeated referral and assessment. And hopefully this will become apparent through the morning that actually we're not focusing on NHS services alone here. We're trying to have joined up cross-sector care pathways where we're all contributing and working together to ensure a seamless experience for the individual affected, who is always central to what we're doing. So this is a document that if people are interested in going into the detail a bit, I'd recommend to them. This was published in November 2020, and it's really the specification for traumatic stress Wales. As I said to you, we're based within the Welsh Health Specialist Services Committee, and hopefully we adhere strongly to their values of respect, partnership, improvement, and innovation. We're after giving equitable access to evidence-based services, working to a nationally agreed model of care and practice framework, but acknowledging that there are major differences across Wales geographically and in terms of service configuration and the experience and the skills of individual practitioners. That means that we don't think that the exact form of everything should be the same in Wales. We think they can look different, but we want the functions and the outcomes to be consistent. So in other words, what we want is to do things that help to improve the health and well-being of people affected by traumatic events. We want to use a continuously improving national approach, and we want to be outcomes driven, which means that we're data driven as well. So we're developing at the moment a national data set to monitor and facilitate the improvement activity that we're going to be delivering. So the Traumatic Stress Wales Hub is based, as I said, with Income Taff Morgannwg University Health Board, and we provide hopefully leadership, coordination, communication. We're developing, and we'll hear a lot more about some of these things as the morning goes on, materials for across Wales, data processing and reporting. We hope to facilitate benchmarking across different areas in Wales, but we want to do that in a peer format so that we're working together and doing peer-based audit of individuals' services, and then constructively and formatively developing services as we go along. We're involved in training, which we'll discuss, knowledge management, and we also offer a consultation and second opinion service to people within Wales, services who would like to have a second opinion perhaps, or discuss somebody with us to get another pair of eyes, or some other thoughts on someone, and hopefully that will develop more over forthcoming years. This is our organogram as things stand at the moment. So we report into Sean Lewis, who's the director of WISC, and we have a small but excellent team within the Traumatic Stress Wales Hub, several of whom you'll be meeting this morning. So Tom, Claire and Matt are all going to be giving talks this morning. We're just about to appoint a project manager to Traumatic Stress Wales, which we think will really help us to drive things forward in the future. And Martin Hoff has just joined us as Senior Information Analyst and has already hit the ground very much running and is helping us greatly in developing our core data set, which we hope we'll be able to roll out across Wales in the not too distant future. And then I've mentioned Emma as our Senior Administrator who coordinates events such like this and keeps us on track in many ways. We have different work streams, and so these work streams were developed as a result of priority areas given to us by Welsh Government when we were developing a proposal for Traumatic Stress Wales. This is not an exhaustive list, and certainly one of the things that we're discussing now is thinking about whether we should be introducing new work streams in the future to cater for other important groups. And again, not an exhaustive list, but for example, older people, people with learning disability, people with comorbid physical and traumatic stress related issues, and also substance use issues along with traumatic stress issues are some of the key areas that we would like to move into more. I mentioned assessment and outcomes, or I mentioned at least having a core outcome data set, and this is one of our key work streams, and we're very much aligning to national policy. We do this with all of our different work streams, but to just give one example, in our assessments and outcomes, we're very much measuring outcomes according to the three-pronged approach recommended by Welsh Government, whereby we look at some clinical outcomes. We also monitor and establish individual goals with the individuals that are receiving services, and we co-produce these goals with the individual, and then they're asked to assess how close they're getting towards achieving their goals through their work with us. And then finally, the third prong to this approach is a satisfaction survey at the end of receiving treatment with us. And again, all of this data we will analyse and help to drive up the quality of the services. You've heard me mention this a few times, but we're very committed to providing and delivering evidence-based services across Wales, and we're very reliant on the guidance that's come out in the last few years to inform what should be going on in Wales. We haven't got clarity in every single area, so where we haven't got clarity, we're advocating evidence-informed approaches. But for a lot of areas, for example, the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, we've got a strong evidence base that shows us that particular treatments do seem to work more than some other treatments may. We've got the NICE guidelines, UK-wide, the International Society for Traumatic Stress guidelines, and also we've got the Matrix Cymru and Matrix Plant evidence tables, which really are the guidelines for psychological therapies for both children and adults within Wales. And we're going to have a session focused on these and pharmacological management after the break later this morning. Key to actually achieving our aims is to develop, disseminate and implement effective interventions for both the prevention and the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, we're looking at this in an all-age approach and using a variety of different techniques. Claire's going to be talking about safety and stabilisation work that's been piloted a bit later, and we see this as really sitting in that place before people come in to receiving specific treatments for example, PTSD and complex PTSD, but as a key component of an overall care pathway. We're then looking at sort of a stepped pathway or a stratified pathway whereby we accurately assess individuals and match an appropriate treatment if they want treatment, and we agree that that's appropriate together for them, that meets their needs or is most likely to meet their needs. And that follows a guided self-help followed by face-to-face therapy approach, using evidence-based techniques such as cognitive behavioural therapy with a trauma focus, and also eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and then prescribing, we also know has a strong evidence base. The overall efficacy of it seems to be a bit less than psychological treatment if you can fully engage in psychological treatment, but a lot of people receive both pharmacological and psychological treatment, and so we're after adopting a kind of a socio-psycho-bio approach. I just think that sounds better than biopsychosocial, to actually deliver our services to people. And then, of course, with children, there are other ways of delivering and other media that we would be working through that Siobhan's going to talk to later on. A particular thing that we're very interested in doing and we're developing are guided self-help interventions. So Sarah mentioned Spring, which is a step-by-step treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder that we've developed over a period of about 11 years now within Cardiff University, and are now rolling out across Wales with the support of Traumatic Stress Wales. So Neil Kitchener and myself have trained up about 80 people now across Wales in delivering Spring, and it's being delivered to a lot of different people. And an exciting thing here is that we're also now having people such as Mark Lawler, who are getting involved in becoming trainers to also deliver Spring training themselves. So in Cumtaff, then 3 colleagues within Cumtaff Morgannwg are working with me at the moment to become trainers to deliver Spring by running a group for staff within Cumtaff and also a few other health boards as well. We're also developing a guided self-help intervention for complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is based on the evidence-based treatment of STARE narrative therapy developed by Marilyn Cloyter and colleagues. And in fact, Marilyn's helping us a lot with this work. And that's just sort of a preview of some of the work. That's just one sort of screenshot of part of this guided self-help intervention we're developing for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The other 2 guided self-help interventions we're developing are for children and young people, and then another one for people experiencing prolonged grief disorder, adults with prolonged grief disorder, which is really back on some funding that we were given as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and expected issues following that. Other key areas of work, and I said that we'll cover some of these, but we can't go into everything in great detail. On national resource development, we're developing videos to help people understand more about post-traumatic stress disorder, but also to help practitioners learn more about techniques and giving some helpful techniques in delivering particular trauma-focused therapies. For example, we're going to be developing e-learning modules in the future. As Sarah mentioned, we do a lot of research in combination with the National Centre for Mental Health. And so with another hat, I lead the Traumatic Stress Research Group at Cardiff University. And we're very much aligning to make sure that we are research-driven, improvement-driven, innovation-driven to drive up quality through Traumatic Stress Wales. We've also got some fantastic partnerships developed and developing with people like the Adverse Childhood Experiences Hub to try and develop an All Wales framework around trauma-informed practice. HHP Wales, Health for Health Professionals Wales, delivering support to people working in the NHS, and this will be expanding to people working in social care in Wales. Spring is one of the core interventions being used within that initiative now, and we're also working closely with Mind in terms of developing a proposal to work with children and young people moving forward in the future. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to hand over now to Tom Hoare, and as you saw from that brief organogram, then Tom is our psychological therapist lead for children and young people, but Tom also is responsible for our refugee, asylum seeker and migrants work within Traumatic Stress Wales, and it's on that topic that Tom's going to talk today. So Tom, over to your good self.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Hoare, and I'm the, as John says, I'm currently working as the Traumatic Stress Wales lead for children and young people, but I'm also leading on the refugee and asylum seeker work streams. So I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and I trained in Wales. And it's a real pleasure to be presenting to yourselves today around a topic that I feel really passionate about, which is around working with people who seek sanctuary. So by people seeking sanctuary, I'm talking here about people with a background as a refugee or an asylum seeker. And it was really lovely actually hearing Sarah talk in the previous presentation about the importance of co-production, and we're hopefully going to be using this as a bit of a guide for the refugee and asylum seeker work stream, and hopefully some of those ideas will come across to yourselves in the presentation this morning as well. Once I'd qualified in South Wales, I spent around 4 years working overseas in areas that have been affected by humanitarian disasters. So thinking there about conflict settings or areas where there's been significant internal displacement or significant migration over borders. In those 4 years, I worked across a number of different countries. So most recently in 2018, I spent just under a year working predominantly in North Syria, but I also spent time working in Iraq and Turkey. So that was, that was during the civil war in Syria, and as people probably know, a time of huge displacement, both within Syria itself, but also across borders into Iraq and Turkey and throughout Europe and beyond. Prior to that, I'd spent a short while working in Myanmar. So I worked there during the Bangladeshi refugee crisis, where people from the Rohingya background were were fleeing Myanmar and crossing over into Bangladesh. So I worked there for a number of months doing a sort of rapid psychosocial, like mental health assessment. And then before that, I'd worked in Ethiopia and worked across Ethiopia. So worked in the north part, particularly working with refugees who'd crossed from the Eritrean border into Ethiopia, but also one of a huge humanitarian crisis in South Sudan that I'm not sure whether people will be aware of, but lots of people crossing the border from South Sudan into Ethiopia, and huge refugee camps there, and I'll go on to talk a little bit about that. And also in Nigeria as well. So I spent just over a year in Nigeria also. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit today about some of my experiences in these countries, and hopefully how this has shaped my thinking and my work with traumatic stress Wales. So I'd always really had a kind of real interest in working with people who'd been displaced. There's quite a strong history in my own family context around in terms of migration, but I'd also done some work with Neil, who's one of the other speakers this morning, doing some research when I was doing my training as a clinical psychologist with asylum seekers, and thinking about how asylum seekers cope with the asylum process, and you know, how that kind of affects their mental health. But once I'd sort of qualified in South Wales, after working in the NHS for a couple of years, I went to work for this organisation called Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF for short. And this is a French organisation, predominantly. Well, the organisation began in France in the 1960s in response to the Biafran conflict in southern Nigeria. And I spent, as I say, I spent about 4 years working for MSF. So just to give you a little bit of background about what MSF actually is, it's a humanitarian organisation first and foremost. So as an organisation, they don't look to kind of go into a kind of place and look to develop sort of longer term projects. They're very much identifying where humanitarian crises are happening and sending in a kind of immediate response to work in the sort of short to medium term before looking to hand over any activities to local actors. And so they're a humanitarian organisation first and foremost. Originally, when MSF started out, they were very much medical in their outlook. So looking at kind of developing surgical programs, vaccination programs, primary healthcare, maternity services, and so on. But as MSF has developed, mental health and psychosocial support have been really recognised as as a real need. And in the 1990s, I think the first mental health program with MSF was started, and that was in the Balkans. And what was noticed was a lot of people were presenting at primary healthcare clinics with and really experienced the effects of really devastating traumatic events, so displacement, violence, sexual trauma, and so on. So in recognition of this, MSF began to establish mental health and psychosocial support programs as a core component of every intervention that they're involved in, and as a result now they're fairly ubiquitous within all of their programs. And you know, it would be unusual nowadays to find a program in MSF that didn't have a mental health officer present in there. So, I mean, just to give you a kind of couple of examples on this slide of some of the programs that I've been involved in. So on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a picture on the top left of a friend of mine called Bizrat, who's an Ethiopian logistician. And I don't know whether or not you can see it very clearly in the background. It's not a great photo, but there's a refugee camp which Bizrat's looking down onto. That's a refugee camp called Kule, Kule on the Ethiopian side of the South Sudanese border, near a place called Gambela in southwestern Ethiopia. And this was just one of 2 or 3 camps there that had hundreds of thousands of people there. So Kule, as one camp, had 100,000 people there in the time that I was working there. And below that is a small image of the pretty kind of modest supportive care team. The words above the supportive care team on the bottom there, that translates as supportive care team in Nuer, which was the South Sudanese particular dialect that people were speaking in Kule. And I'll go on to talk about some of the activities that we were running in this team in a moment. But on the right-hand side is a couple of images from northern Syria. So this is in a town called Kobani, which is on the right on the kind of Syrian-Turkish border. So it's in North Syria. The image on the far right-hand side is just a shot of one of the streets in Kobani, which, as you can see, has been kind of completely obliterated as a result of the ongoing conflict and airstrikes and so on. And when MSF went in there for the first time, we started to set up this program on the sort of on the left-hand side of that image. There's a small group of people, and we set up a small community centre. So we called this Step by Step. And that was something that the team there, all of whom were made up of local staff, were selected that as the name of the community centre. So in terms of the sorts of activities that MSF engages in, often going in there as a mental health professional. As an expatriate, you're often the only mental health professional in a region, and you might be looking at working with local staff to help get an understanding of what the mental health needs are and develop some sort of support services. So the supportive care team and the step-by-step programs are 2 sort of examples of that. And often you'd be seeing people in these services where people have been exposed to really traumatic events, so displacement, war, torture, bereavement, and so on. But in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the types of activities that we were involved in developing in. I mean, these images here are from the ones on the right-hand side are from Nigeria, but the one on the left-hand side is from Ethiopia. And this is just to give you a bit of a sense of some of the activities that we were doing, and has also really helped shape my understanding of what pathways look like. And that's been a kind of particularly prominent feature of my work with traumatic stress Wales as well. So in these images, you can see on the top left-hand side, there was a small team of local councillors. This is Kingsley, Benret and Farida on the top left-hand side. Now, it was my role going into this context in northern Nigeria. It was really trying to help sort of sprinkle some principles and ideas about kind of good mental health support. So maybe thinking about confidentiality, maybe thinking about how to develop spaces to talk if people wanted it. With a full kind of acknowledgement that it would be no good having a Western mental health professional like myself, who's got sort of maybe some background and experience about how to practice mental health support in Wales, but no realistic idea about how that would be delivered and developed locally. So really the councillors here were really not just councillors, but they were sort of cultural translators really, and just really sort of helped me to understand how such support can be delivered in this particular context. So all of the activities that were developed there were really highly co-produced. So we were always kind of really mindful of the local cultural values as well. So some of these activities, I mean, we've sort of labelled them here as psychosocial stimulation activities, but really these were activities that sort of people would have an interest in attending. So often there would be sort of groups for men, groups for women, groups for mothers and babies. There would be mother and baby groups often, and groups for children, teenage groups as well. And the sort of counsellors would really kind of guide what sorts of things people would be interested in. By having a really good understanding of that local context, and they would be so they would often start off as an enjoyable activity, but really this was an opportunity to start to talk to people about about some of these ideas outlined in the resources for psychoeducation image here. So starting to talk to people about noticing that yourself or family members are feeling sad, scared, fearful, isolated, having difficulty sleeping, and so on. Now, so it was used as really as like a platform to start talking about some of those challenges. And if necessary, then a person might say, oh, I wouldn't mind having a longer conversation about this. So they would then go to one of the counsellors to have a conversation about that, and maybe a number of sessions would be set up, or a kind of intervention plan would be developed on the back of that. So hopefully that's giving you a bit of a sort of sense of some of the ideas that we were using in MSF, and just to kind of highlight again that these resources, the psychoeducation poster that was developed there, I mean, obviously that would be translated, and all of the images that you can see next to those regularly sad, scared or fearful, isolated, trouble sleeping, and so on. They were all developed together between the counsellors and a group of people and a local artist. So the local artist would, sort of try and then develop an image that would kind of capture those ideas and that would be kind of culturally relevant. So, again, sort of very co-produced, and hopefully then used as a way of starting a conversation in some of those activities with people. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea about some of the activities that we were doing there. Now, just to go on, so I mean, how does all of this relate to our work at Traumatic Stress Wales? So after spending that time working overseas, I spent a couple of years working in an amazing team in Aneurin Bevan called the MIST team, and MIST work with young people and families involved in the care system, provide wraparound trauma support. This post came up at Traumatic Stress Wales, and has allowed me to kind of pursue my interest in working with people who are seeking sanctuary. As people might have a sense of, refugees and asylum seekers often face huge barriers to accessing appropriate support, and often have higher exposure to traumatic events in their country of origin, in the process of flight. So moving across Europe, I mean, not a day goes by really when we're not seeing some sort of images of various disasters that have happened in channel crossings and so on. So often very traumatic experiences there, but also in the process of resettlement in the UK and Wales. So quite often people who work in services don't necessarily always feel that confident about how to support people who've been through those types of experiences. So what we're doing at TSW is we're putting together a work group that's got representation from Welsh Migration Strategic Partnership, health, so the NHS staff, social care and the third sector. So as John was saying earlier on, very cross-sector representation. And we're specifically looking at supporting the development of streamlined pathways, so from intensive sort of individual and group psychological interventions to supporting frontline staff with learning around what reactions to traumatic events as related to this population. So I know that Claire's going to go and come on and talk about that in a little bit now. And a really significant part of this is around resource development, and co-production is a key part of this. So ideally today, I was hoping to have, we're in the process of setting up a reference group of people who are either refugees or asylum seekers themselves. So we've had really good interest in that, and ideally it would have been good to co-present the discussion today, but we're just in the early stages of setting up that group. And this group is going to really help us to develop these resources, and I think that's hopefully, again, as Sarah was saying earlier on, using co-production as a really strong basis for any resources that are being developed. So just to give you a bit of an overview about some of the resources that have been developed so far, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a small handful of examples that we've developed to date. I think one of the key sort of pieces of work that we've been involved in is around the recent sort of Afghan resettlement scheme, and together with my colleague Bev in the Welsh Government, we've put together the image on the left-hand side here is going to be intended to be it's a Welsh health circular. So that's in the process of being prepared, and will hopefully be distributed kind of really soon. That's a document that contains lots of links and direction to various resources that have been translated into kind of multiple languages, particularly thinking for people who've resettled from Afghanistan into Pashto, into Dari, and it contains a number of links related to both physical and mental health, and hopefully that will be sort of distributed across Wales, and will prove to be helpful for health professionals who are coming into contact with people who've recently arrived from Afghanistan. And on the right-hand side is an image of a toolkit that's been developed by the National Centre for Mental Health. And again, this is a toolkit that outlines a number of kind of strategies, so grounding, relaxation techniques, explanations about what trauma is, and that again has been translated into Pashto and Dari by the Welsh Government. So really grateful for that, and those resources can be found on our website. And then finally, just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of two storyboards that have been produced. And Claire again did a lot of work with people with lived experience of being refugees and asylum seekers, and basically these are two stories. So the image on the left hand side is a kind of just a snapshot of one of those storyboards of a lady called Sarah and her husband and her children, and that storyboard tells the story about some of the kind of traumatic events that had happened to Sarah. So that her husband was taken away, not to be seen again by the authorities. Her home was subject to an airstrike, and she had to begin a process of moving across Syria and across Europe to Wales. And on the right-hand side is the story of an Iranian refugee called Mehdi. So both of these stories sort of articulate what had happened to both of these individuals in their country of origin, in the process of fight, and then in resettlement, but with a kind of really important, hopeful edge to them as well. So describing some of the ways in which Sarah and Mehdi were able to kind of recover from some of the traumatic events that they've been exposed to. So whether or not that was, here are some examples from Mehdi here. So going for coffee with friends, volunteering at his local mosque, helped other people with their asylum cases. So we're thinking really carefully about how these can be distributed. So thinking about whether they can be distributed as booklets or as WhatsApp messages or as short animated videos. So these are just going to be sort of signed off through the reference group now, and hopefully distributed quite soon. So Sorry, that was a little bit rushed towards the end there, but I'd be more than happy to take any questions towards the end. I'm just keeping a bit of an eye on the time and see that we're coming to the end of my slot here. So thanks very much for listening, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about some of these experiences today. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, please do keep the questions coming into the chat bar. We're making a note of them all, so we will deal with them at the end. And it's great to see some conversation going on in there as well. So next up, Claire Kroll-Rees is going to talk to us about safety and stabilisation. Claire is the psychological therapist lead within Traumatic Stress Wales on the adult side. So Claire, if I can hand over to you.
Hi, everybody. As John has said, I'm going to talk about emotional safety and stabilisation skills training that we've developed and that we're piloting with frontline staff. So the context of this is the pilot training that we are delivering at the moment is being rolled out in partnership with Cardiff and Vale Area Partnership Boards. So we're collaborating with Lucy James, who's leading on that from the Cardiff and Vale side. There's a kind of real awareness that frontline staff across substance misuse, but also in working with other vulnerable groups, so survivors of domestic violence, refugees and asylum seekers, and people in the criminal justice system, working with people who've experienced often multiple prolonged experiences of interpersonal trauma, so in childhood and adulthood, a real risk of polytraumatization. And the impact of these, unfortunately, is a kind of really complex interacting picture of social, psychological and physical issues. And what we find is there's high rates of PTSD and also especially complex PTSD in this group. And what we know, people with complex PTSD particularly, kind of there's a real kind of need for social and emotional safety and stabilisation. And often these groups are the most in need of effective mental health services, but unfortunately they're often the ones that actually experience significant barriers to access, and they've got really high levels of unmet needs. So this was the context really that we started this work in. And this really fits with a wider agenda of Traumatic Stress Wales, where one of the key bits of work is we're really trying to integrate trauma pathways. So there's a real acknowledgement that recovery doesn't just happen in mental health services and within trauma therapies, but it happens across the whole pathway. And what we know is that these vulnerable groups who've experienced this developmental trauma and kind of polytraumatization are often supported by organisations in social care, housing, voluntary and community organisations and health services, and they're seen as a really important part of the pathway, and they're doing really fantastic work and often have really strong relationships and are really kind of wrapping around the individual. And this is kind of alongside a real acknowledgement really that evidence-based psychological therapies are embedded within trauma-informed systems and organisations. So what we're trying to do is to think about whether we could kind of integrate and to kind of join up these systems so that actually the trauma pathway can be brought forward, and so that there's consistency of an approach and consistency of language, and particularly with a view to the emotional safety and stabilisation. So we were really interested to see whether actually we could bring that forward and embed it into the routine practice of frontline staff. And I've kind of mentioned no wrong door in this slide, but that was a kind of a real sort of approach that we wanted to kind of embed within this, that actually that there's that consistent approach along the pathway and that were people being moved along the pathway. So we partnered with Cardiff and Vale Area Partnership Board to develop this pilot training. And so the pilot is with people with substance misuse difficulties and also who are at risk of homelessness or are homeless. And I've mentioned on the slide a few of the different organisations that we sort of partnered with to deliver the training. So Pobble, Recovery Cymru and Defodl, and colleagues for there have been instrumental in driving this forward and being part of this. So we're massively grateful to them. So in terms of how we started to develop the process really, so what we did to start with is we sent a semi-structured questionnaire widely out to stakeholders across Wales, across different groups, so working with in different settings, so working with survivors of domestic violence, refugees and asylum seekers, the whole kind of spectrum of approaches. So what we wanted to really do is to kind of get a sense of what people thought would be most helpful to have in the training, and we were also really interested to kind of know about kind of what sort of method of delivery would be best and most effective, and also thinking about implementation, so how we could get this embedded within organisations and systems, and how this could kind of be developed and implemented most effectively and successfully. So based on the outcomes of the questionnaire, then we developed a multi-agency focus group to give kind of more detailed in-depth views on the content, the delivery method and the optimal implementation process. And alongside that, then we also held a focus group which was comprised of experts with lived experience of substance misuse, trauma and kind of co-occurring mental health difficulties. And then we brought these kind of two groups together just to kind of develop this steering group of experts by experience and also experts by professional training and practice that led on the development of the training. So we really wanted to make sure that it was as effective and it was kind of co-produced as possible, and that it was really based on the views of kind of people kind of who would be using the services and also delivering interventions. So then we developed a draft version of the training materials, and this was reviewed and refined before we developed the pilot. And as I said, Cardiff and Area Partnership Board have partnered to develop and deliver the pilot. And one of the things that came up very strongly in the focus groups particularly was that actually in order for this to be successful, we needed to kind of get managers and services embedded right from the start. So we kind of, it's been brilliant that Cardiff and Vale Area Partnership Board were able to do that. So they've really kind of co-owned this and driven it forward. So we're massively grateful. So what we kind of came up with really in terms of content and method of delivery and implementation was that we developed a train the trainer approach. So train the trainer is an approach where you train an initial cohort from organisations, and that they will then deliver the training within their own networks, organisations, to their colleagues. So this is a way to kind of overcome one of the barriers to this kind of approach, which is how do you cascade kind of the consistent content of the training kind of widely within organisations and make sure that it's embedded within the practice of organisations. And the advantage of this is that then that cohort of trainers are kind of expert in their clients, in their services, and in their kind of organisations. So this was an approach that we've kind of developed for this training. So we called this phase 1 training, which is this initial cohort of trainers. And so what the training consisted of was 7 weekly sessions. So what people told us was that rather than have a workshop over 1 or 2 days, what they'd prefer to do is a course, because then you're able to kind of embed the skills within their practice over weeks, and also then you're able to sort of develop a kind of community of practice with the other trainers across networks. And I think that was one of the things that has been really positive about this. And then in addition to those 7 weekly sessions, the first cohort of trainers got 3 weekly sessions in addition to that. So it's skills for delivering training and reflective practice. And so that covered things in terms of how you give and you facilitate feedback for practical exercises, how you deliver reflective practice sessions, and kind of just in terms of kind of more confidence really in the kind of practicalities of delivering training. The training was delivered by Zoom necessarily because it was during lockdown, so very much a focus was on how you deliver training by Zoom and how you navigate those kind of practical issues around that. The other thing that kind of came up really strongly in the development process of this is that training without ongoing support that isn't embedded within reflective practice actually isn't as effective, and people really wanted this kind of reflective practice component as well. So the model that we kind of came up with was that we had 6 monthly reflective practice sessions delivered after the training, that would be embedded to help people kind of reflect and to embed this approach in their practice. And as well as that, then we've offered 6 monthly sessions of training consultation drop-in, which is purely just for any practical issues that people came up with or identified in delivering the training. So that was the package for phase 1. And then phase 2, which we're currently in at the moment, which is then these cohort of trainers are then going to deliver the training within their own organisations or networks. And the training that they're delivering is part 1. So it's the 7 weekly sessions of safety and stabilisation skills for trauma, and then also reflective practice, so 6 monthly sessions. So in terms of the content of training, so this is the focus of training is about enhancing the routine practice of frontline staff. So it's not delivered as a formal intervention. And I know some sort of safety and stabilisation, there's lots of different models around, but what we wanted to do is to see whether actually we could embed it within that routine practice. So you're using that relational component and sort of seeing whether you can kind of enhance and skill up and help staff to feel more confident in delivering emotional and safety and stabilisation within their work. So the first one was about introduction to trauma. Self-care and reflective practice was a massive part of this, because we really wanted kind of within trauma-informed practice more generally, but it felt really important that this self-reflection and self-care was a really, really important part of this approach. So this was actually embedded kind of within the content of all of the different modules, as well as then those reflective practice sessions afterwards. We also talked about the impact of traumatic events, so thinking around the prevalence of trauma, kind of the impact that it has on people, kind of the sorts of difficulties that then people might present with, and just kind of starting to kind of formulate really people's difficulties or sort of their coping strategies as a way of them coping with the impact of trauma. So it's that sort of thinking rather than, the what's happened to you rather than the what's wrong with you approach. So it talks about the impact of traumatic events, and then also started then to think around the kind of need for safety in an organisation. So characteristics of traumatic events, so kind of that coercion, loss of control, breach of trust, and those kinds of characteristics, and then starting to kind of think about how that might create barriers to access into services, how it might potentially risk the re-traumatisation within services, and then crucially then you can start to have those conversations within your routine practice of, how has it impacted you, how can we help you to feel safe within the organisation. So that's kind of that collaborative, kind of co-produced approach to that kind of that care and that support. We also talked about recognising and talking about trauma, because that came up a lot in terms of the work that we've done when we've spoken to stakeholders. And so thinking about, how do you talk to people about trauma? Is it okay to talk about that? How can you do that safely without kind of unpacking things that don't feel safe in that context? But also understanding that actually that the impact of trauma is kind of a really kind of key part of the work that you're doing when you're supporting people with those kind of consequences of that. Looking at the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is this kind of diagram on the right hand side, but this was a framework that we've used, and the feedback that we're getting is that this feels like a really useful framework. So we're really embedding this thing about the concepts of the red, the green and the blue zones, and the green zone is that kind of optimal functioning where people are able to reflect and they're able to think, and they're able to kind of react to kind of what's going on around them. But what we know is about people who've experienced trauma, that often the red zone, which is that kind of fight or flight survival mode, and people often kind of very quickly are triggered triggered environmentally or interpersonal triggers into that red zone. And so just recognizing with people about, how would we know when you're in your red zone, what's happening in your body, how does your thinking change, how would I know, kind of are there warning signs for that, how can we help you to move back into your green zone? So that's the kind of framework that we're using, and that was sort of embedding a lot of the skills. And then the blue zone, which is that hyper arousal where people get quite numb or detached or disengaged, and again it's a very similar approach. So how would we know that, and what can we do to help you to move back into your green zone? So that's the kind of framework. So we wanted to kind of pitch it, so it's evidence-based, it's based on theory of what's happening in the brain, and what we know about trauma, but it's just kind of very kind of accessible, simple language that you can kind of help people to start to develop a conversation and support them with that. And then based on that is thinking around how we can help to calm your body down, so sort of breathing strategies, how can we help you with grounding, how can we help you to cope with emotions and to recognize them and to express them in ways that maybe feel safer, How can we help you to cope with triggers, so sensory and interpersonal triggers, and then how sort of the putting it all together. So that's the sort of sense about how you can use these approaches flexibly when you're supporting people. So starting to kind of develop a way of sort of almost making sense of a person's difficulties. And so what we wanted to do is to think about that this could be a kind of consistent language that teams could use to describe some of the difficulties that people might be experiencing and ways that you could support them with that. So that's the content of the training. So in terms of who's been trained, so phase 1 training, so that was the one that was delivered, co-delivered by Lucy James and by myself. And also we had an expert by lived experience who co-facilitated that training as well. So we had 22 people that were trained in the initial cohort across 10 different organisations. So we had CAU as one of them, so that was the health services organisation, and then the other organisations were third sector and community and social care. And then the phase 2 rollout of the training, which is ongoing. So to date, the most people that have been trained have been through CAU. So they've been sort of doing really kind of amazing kind of effective work in terms of rolling out the training. And then we've got 3 third sector organisations that have delivered at least one training course, and then we've got 2 more that are due to start at the beginning of the next year. And we've got 50 people in so far who've been trained in the phase 2 rollouts of these organisations. So what we found out so far is the training is acceptable to the trainees, and we one of the kind of things that we've really done is this co-production. So I know that's been a bit of a theme that's been running through the presentations, but we developed it really carefully. We've delivered it with we've co-delivered it with somebody who's an expert with lived experience. But also what we've done is in this first phase of the training, we used this approach called Menti polls. So we were getting live feedback as we went along in the sessions. So things like this one at the bottom. So we get polls, maybe sort of 3 each session. So how is the speed of the training? And you get people say just right or too slow. I think, yeah, that one, it was mostly just right, which is good. And a couple said it was too fast. And so that's really enabled. So we were literally developing the training as we went along from session to session. And then the slide above, we also did these word clouds. So we'd ask things like, what did you like best about the today's session? And then from that, we'd ask things like, is there anything that you didn't understand or anything you'd like to know more about or anything that didn't feel helpful? So from that, we really were kind of week to week really developing the training. So in terms of acceptability, we really feel like this is a kind of an approach that we've tried to kind of co-produce it. We know the training improves knowledge and skills, so we've done some pre and post questionnaires around that, and it does have a significant impact on knowledge and skills. But we also ask people about impact on practice. So we ask people about, actually, have you been able to use these skills on knowledge, and has it changed your practice? And there's real variability across organisations, which I think needs further exploration, because I think that will speak to the fact that organisational factors, we know that organisational factors have a huge impact on the practice of individuals working in them. So we think that this variability that might kind of be speaking to that. So we think that that's we'd love to kind of explore that further. Pros and cons of digital delivery. I mean, this is something that we've all experienced, every day of our lives, really. In terms of digital delivery, does have some advantages. It makes the training more accessible. We've been able to kind of deliver it, I guess, across a wider area, and it's more convenient for people. And some of the functionality, so for instance, the Menti polls have been really helpful, and I don't think we would have been able to do that in the same way. But obviously there are some disadvantages, and particularly face-to-face, people felt the practicals, so the role plays and the practical skills, they felt that they weren't quite, they didn't work quite as well through breakout rooms. So I think going forward in phase 2, we've said to the organisations that it's a complete choice whether they want to deliver it face-to-face or digitally, and I think some of them may go down a sort of hybrid model. And then what we also know is that the train-the-trainer model is feasible, so people have been starting to roll it out within their organisations. And what also it's been helpful is that actually some of the smaller organisations have sort of buddied up, so it kind of makes the training model easier, because it's, you know, you can kind of use trainers from different organisations, or you can, if there's spaces in training, you can kind of people from different organisations can join that. So that's been really helpful. But speaking to the slide before, some of the organisations haven't been able to deliver it yet, and so that there's factors in terms of that they felt they haven't had capacity to do that, or you know, the staffing hasn't allowed it. So that's one of the other things to explore, really, in terms of the organisations that haven't been able to deliver the training today, about, you know, how we can help them to do that. And then what we still need to find out, so does the training have the same outcomes when cascaded within organisations? So we don't know whether the impact on the knowledge and skills and the levels of satisfaction will be the same in this phase 2 as the phase 1. And that's really crucial, because I think we're relying on this train-the-trainer model as a way of cascading this approach at scale, but actually we just need to know whether actually it's as effective and whether people can deliver it in the same consistency. So that's one of the things we're interested in exploring at the moment. Does reflective practice increase the effectiveness of the training? I mean, we assume it does, and the literature would suggest it does, but we're really interested to know actually in practice, do these reflective practice sessions actually increase the effectiveness? So that's one of the other things that we're looking to explore. Do service users experience an improvement in their well-being? I mean, ultimately, that's what we're all here for, is that we want to improve outcomes and the experience and the well-being of people that use our services. And this kind of approach, where you're embedding these in routine practice within organisations, actually there is a kind of lack of really evaluation in terms of actually whether that's translating to the experience of people that use services. So that's something that we're really kind of keen to look at as well, and to think about how we can start to explore that. And also whether the programme's feasible and acceptable to managers and commissioners, because obviously there is a resource attached to this in terms of the time that's been taken out by people being on the training and also delivering the training. And so we kind of need to know whether actually that they feel like it's kind of having an impact and it's helpful for the organisation. So that's one of the other things that we're interested in. And then finally, it's what model of training works best. So as we said, it's just trying to think about whether train the trainer is the way forward, or what kind of, you know, version of train the trainer we're looking at, kind of in terms of how we embed it. So thinking about sort of champions, for instance, within organisations, or so just trying to really think about what model of training might work best. And then the next stage as well for us is then to think about whether it can be rolled out and used within other organisations. So we've had really lots of interest and support from people across a wide range of sort of different frontline services and organisations, and so really just trying to think around whether that's an approach that we can adapt and we can start to roll out as well. And then just finishing with a couple of quotes. So this was, we did some kind of qualitative work with some of the people that have been on the training, just to kind of get their views and their take on it. So one person has said, we're more confident talking about the person's trauma now. We're more comfortable with talking about the reasons why and how they got to where they were. So I think that's a kind of nice description, really, of kind of what we're trying to achieve with that. People sort of feel like more confident about it, and you're starting to have the conversation and using that knowledge as a basis to help the person to develop more effective coping strategies to help them with the impact of their trauma. But the other quote there will be, it'll be interesting to see this uniformity of language. Some organisations will go back to sitting alone, but we work closely with another service and it will improve relationships. So I think for them, it's like really flagging up that there's this consistency of approach which helped. And what people have actually said is that it was starting to improve sort of, you know, referrals between organisations. So people were more considered and they were using a similar kind of language when they were starting to kind of talk about some of the impacts. But just in terms of actually whether that can be embedded and kind of whether that will actually like translate to you know, lasting impact on pathways, that's something that we need to explore. So that's the kind of end of my presentation, really. So it's just a real overview of the work that we've done and developing the training, and yeah, we'll kind of, when we kind of get some sort of more final results from the pilot, we can share with you as we go forward as well. So yeah, that's me. And so thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Claire. That's great, and I think that's a really good point to break, reflect on what we've spoken about so far, and then we'll come back at 11:15 to start again. Hi everyone, and welcome back. Hopefully everybody's feeling refreshed after a cup of tea or coffee or something. So we're going to move on, and just one comment from me before we start is that there's been quite a few questions in the chat about accessing training, and just to let everybody know that, as Claire I think was talking to, we're piloting this work at the moment, and then the hope is that we'll come up with a model that can then be rolled out further. So we'll certainly be keeping everybody involved that's part of this webinar as to any developments in that area. So it's watch this space, and hopefully there will be training available moving forward in the future. But without further ado, let's move on to this next discussion, which is going to focus really on the evidence base for the management of post-traumatic stress disorder, essentially. And we're very grateful to Neil Roberts for joining us today to talk about the development of the matrix plans and Cymru updated tables, and to give an overview of the matrix Cymru tables as they what they talk about with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder. So Neil has been a key figure in the development of the new tables, and is also the Traumatic Stress Wales lead for Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. So Neil, over to yourself.
So hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at this webinar today. And as John says, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist with Cardiff and Vale Health Board, where I lead our local PTSD pathway, and I also have a role as an acting editor for the Matrix Cymru Leadership and Infrastructure Project, which is known as MCLIP, a little bit of a mouthful. So I'll be talking a little bit about that project today, and Matrix Cymru, and trying to give a little bit of an overview of that, and as John said, kind of introducing, describing the PTSD tables. So hopefully some of you will be familiar with a document called Matrix Cymru, which was published in 2017, and I guess was kind of developed in recognition of the fact that the kind of access, availability, and delivery of psychological therapies across Wales is quite variable, and what the kind of Matrix Cymru document tried to do, it was developed through a partnership between a number of different groups, developed with leadership from the National Psychological Therapies Management Committee, which is a committee that has the heads of services from each of the health boards in Wales, with service user representation. So that group, alongside Public Health Wales and local psychological therapy management committees and service user representatives. And the document was influenced by a similar document that was published in Scotland called the Scottish Matrix. And the aim of the publication was really to try to help describe and build a framework for the delivery of effective, equitable, and accessible psychological therapies across the whole of Wales. And it's kind of structured in a number of different sections to assist the planning and delivery of evidence-based psychological therapies within local health boards, local authorities, and with the third sector as well, when third sector commissioning is organised to deliver psychological interventions. Alongside the Matrix Cymru document itself was a second publication called the Matrix Cymru Evidence Table. So these were published in September 2017, and some of you may have seen these tables in the past and may well be very familiar with them. And the aim of these tables really is to provide an accessible summary of the evidence base for specific psychological approaches and interventions organised around particular disorders and problem areas. And the idea kind of behind these tables is that, that they should provide accessible information about what kinds of psychological interventions should be commissioned and delivered by local services, and what clinicians should normally expect to deliver as part of their kind of regular and routine care. So the table kind of recommend specific interventions based on review of the evidence, and the recommendations kind of organised by the severity of a presenting problem or difficulty, and in terms of the kind of level of intensity of a particular intervention. And there is also guidance about the level of evidence supporting specific recommendations. So evidence that's kind of based on high quality randomized controlled trials, where there's kind of consistent kind of patterns in the evidence, would get the kind of highest level of evidence rating, and then recommendations based on lower quality studies would get lower recommendations. And one of the aims of the tables as well is that they should be accessible to service users who have specific problems or difficulties, and carers, so that they should be able to know what kinds of problems, what kinds of interventions they might expect to receive given the kinds of problems that they're experiencing. So the MCLIP project that I'm a part of our role, which I'll talk a little bit more about today, is to update the evidence tables. And I guess there's a question: why do the tables actually need updating? And I think perhaps the kind of first thing to kind of recognise is that the original tables were developed kind of mainly by local clinicians in Wales who had expertise in the treatment of particular problems and difficulties. But the recommendations were based to varying degrees, in varying extents, on in terms of their academic rigour. So I guess it's fair to say that the clinicians who contributed to the original tables didn't all have the opportunity to undertake thorough reviews of the available research literature. And the original tables were published in 2017, and one of the things that we know is that interventions and new approaches are continually being developed, and new research studies will have been published, and over time the existing tables will gradually become out of date. So it's important to try and ensure that the tables, that we have some kind of mechanism process to ensure that the tables remain as up to date as possible. And another criticism perhaps of the original tables is that they were really kind of focused mostly on problems, mental health related problems for adults and older adults. So there were no sections, there was no guidance in relation to children and adolescents, or people with learning disabilities, or people experiencing problems that might be seen in more specialist areas, say in a physical health context. And another criticism that's been made by some individuals is that the tables are kind of mainly structured in a sort of diagnostically driven way. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in MCLIP is to try and develop some new tables that have kind of a trans-diagnostic focus to them, so that they perhaps might also consider interventions and approaches that are perhaps kind of applicable to a range of different problems and disorders. So this slide here just gives you a very, I don't know how easy it is to see, but just kind of gives a little bit of an overview of the MCLIP kind of team and kind of where it sits. So I should just kind of say that it's MCLIP is a pilot project we started in September 2020, and we're still a pilot project at the moment, kind of testing the approaches that we've developed, funded by Improvement Cymru. And the kind of structure is that we have a clinical lead, Liz Andrew, who is the head of adult mental health services in Anara and Bevan, whose a kind of role is to provide leadership to the project, and she has particular kind of focus as well in terms of workforce planning and development. And myself, I'm the kind of the acting kind of honorarium editor, and my role is to try to review and provide a sort of a kind of a position of neutrality in reviewing new tables that are developed, to try and ensure that they follow and meet kind of standards, review standards that we've developed. And we've got a couple of psychology assistants, Jacob Pendry and Evan Osborne, who support the work that we do through doing searches of the literature and some of the screening work for us to kind of help support some of the updating process that's undertaken. I should also mention the important role that Jane Boyd has played in establishing MCLIP. Jane gave a lot of leadership to the project initially, and the support that we've received from Andrea Gray through Improvement Cymru as well. And the kind of the way that sort of the update process works is that we decide on a particular table that we think needs updating, and then we develop a working group which has representatives. So we ask a chair to lead the process, and the group is kind of made up of clinicians and academic experts, where we can get them, who then follow a methodology that we've developed. And just to try and give you a little kind of brief overview of the methodology, it kind of broadly speaking has kind of two phases to it. So the first phase is a literature search and literature appraisal and kind of collation of that literature, to kind of look at what interventions have been evaluated, and the quality of studies that's kind of undertaken that kind of work, and that process kind of we try to kind of undertake a kind of a proportionate process, recognizing that those involved in these working groups are very busy clinicians and academics already, and so normally starting where we can find it from a starting point of kind of existing high quality guidelines like NICE guidelines or the Scottish Sign guidelines, that might provide a starting point for that focus, for that literature search, and the literature then kind of builds on those kind of existing guidelines. And then the second part of the process, which we kind of want to include service users is about kind of developing the recommendations that sit in the tables that are informed by the literature appraisal and searches. And so these recommendations we encourage working groups to take into account things like the benefits and potential harms of particular interventions, the need in a Welsh context, the kind of benefits in terms of the impacts that the intervention might have, the feasibility of delivery also in a Welsh context, and some recognition of where there is kind of limitations in the existing literature. So the working groups complete a review and make recommendations, and then they submit these for editorial review and then hopefully kind of publication. That's the intention. And so in terms of the PTSD tables, so this was one of our first projects, and John was a very obvious person to approach about this as chair, given his experience of chairing the previous NICE guidelines and the International Society for Traumatic Stress guidelines. And we decided that we would undertake an update specifically of the PTSD tables for adults and children and young people. And Siobhan is going to talk about the children and young people tables shortly. We made a decision not to develop at this stage a table on complex PTSD, and that was really because the kind of definition of complex PTSD, as it's sort of now accepted in ICD-11, is a new definition, and there's really very little research around at the moment to support any recommendations. So that's a piece of work that will potentially come later. In terms of the starting point, I think PTSD is perhaps kind of a little unique in the sense that there are a number of high quality and robust treatment guidelines that have been undertaken over the past few years. John mentioned NICE guidelines and the International Society for Traumatic Stress guidelines a little earlier. And more recently, there have also been some guidelines published, the Australian guidelines in 2020. And given that these guidelines already existed, we felt that it wasn't really necessary to undertake further detailed kind of literature search, because a lot of that literature has already been recently been synthesized, and kind of recommendations have kind of been developed. I think one of the things perhaps to say about these kind of guidelines, though, is that they're not always entirely consistent in terms of the recommendations that they made. So I'm going to try and just take you briefly through the adult tables. So there are two tables in the adult section. The first table is looking at recommendations for the prevention and early treatment of PTSD for someone who has been recently exposed to a traumatic incident. And we have three different recommendations here. The first recommendation, so the recommendation with the strongest level of evidence and from the research, the highest level of efficacy, is for individualized trauma-focused CBT for people who are experiencing either acute stress disorder or where there is a clear indication through screening or from diagnosis that they're exhibiting PTSD symptoms. And then there's a second recommendation for something called stepped collaborative care. So these are interventions that are kind of delivered according to need, based on kind of regular assessments over a number of time points. And this kind of intervention hasn't really been trialed or used regularly in a UK context. And so there was quite a lot of evidence from several large trials, but the level of efficacy for this intervention is kind of relatively low. And then a third recommendation for brief EMDR for people experiencing PTSD symptoms. And this recommendation is based on several quite small studies, mainly conducted in Mexico and Israel. So that's why that recommendation gets a kind of a B rating in terms of the level of evidence supporting that recommendation. Just two other points to make in terms of prevention and early treatment. Recommendation that watchful waiting might be appropriate initially if someone experiences early symptoms, and that debriefing would not be an appropriate intervention to offer as a prevention early intervention approach. And then this table here is about recommendations for PTSD treatment, and I guess the group of interventions described in the top row there is kind of the interventions that would be kind of first line recommendations, and I guess there won't be too many surprises for clinicians who are very familiar with this field. So recommendations really for individual trauma-focused CBT through approaches like cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure. These are all established trauma-focused CBT approaches, and for EMDR. So these interventions had the highest level of evidence and the highest efficacy. And then there's a group of interventions that maybe potentially appropriate in certain circumstances that had a high level of evidence but lower level of efficacy. So group-based CBT with a trauma-focused, narrative exposure therapy, which particularly been used with refugees, and present-centered therapy, which is the only non-trauma focused therapy that there's evidence to support, and that potentially provides an alternative for some service users who can't tolerate trauma focused interventions. And then finally, a recommendation for guided internet-based CBT with a trauma-focused. This intervention has got evidence primarily for people with mild to moderate level difficulties. And I'm aware that I'm kind of nearly out of time, so perhaps just to skip forward. So just to say that there is other work that's ongoing through MCLIP as well. Bulimia tables have been completed. There is ongoing work around several other projects, several other tables, open dialogue, emotion regulation based interventions, perinatal psychosis, and we're trying to start a working group on OCD. And we're doing some close collaboration with a similar group in Scotland, where we have Welsh representatives in Scottish groups, and we will hope to be able to make use of the recommendations from the Scottish groups around drug and alcohol abuse, perinatal affective disorders, and anxiety disorders. And just a final slide here, really. So this is the evidence tables have recently been updated with the PTSD and new PTSD and bulimia tables, and available at the link here. And this is a working document. So as new tables get developed, this document will continue to be updated. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. That's great and provides a really helpful overview of the work that's been going on. And there's a lot of work going on, which is fantastic. So next, Siobhan is going to talk to the matrix plant evidence table. So Siobhan is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist based in in Bevan, and has been a massive support to Traumatic Stress Wales since we started. And in fact, Siobhan works with us for a day a week at the moment, supporting all of our work with a particular focus on the children and young people side of things, and was pivotal to the development of the Matrix Plant evidence table. So Siobhan, over to your good self.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be joining you this morning. So I'm Siobhan Henley. I'm a medical doctor and I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist. As a little bit of background, I've lived in Wales since 1989 and completed all my medical and psychiatry training in South Wales. And currently I work in South East Wales in the NHS in an Bevan University Health Board in a CAMHS Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. But as John mentioned, for the last 12 months I've contributed 1 day per week into the TSW Hub, and in particularly contributing to the Children and Young Persons work stream, and more recently into the Refugee and Asylum Seeker work stream with Tom Hoare. So my interest in trauma, the impact of trauma on mental health and the treatment of traumatic stress started when I first trained in an evidence-based talking therapy called EMDR, or full name is Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing, back in 2008. And that interest and passion, if you like, has grown and developed as I understand more about how common the experience of traumatic events is in the general population, and about the impact of disorders such as PTSD and complex PTSD, and in particular how this applies to infants, children and young people. So this morning I'm presenting on behalf of all of those who were involved in the creation of the Matrix Plant evidence tables. So firstly, just thanks to Neil for the previous presentation, which very much sort of ties into my own, giving an overview of Matrix Cymru, the MCLIP table update project on the adult PTS tables. So my presentation focuses very much on the new Matrix Plant evidence tables for the prevention and treatment of PTSD in children and young people. The tables are part of the Matrix Plant approach, which you may be familiar with, and this is created for practitioners working into psychological services to help with the development, planning and delivery of psychological therapy to children, young people and their families across Wales. So the purpose of the Matrix Plant tables is intended to provide easily accessible evidence tables for people working into children's mental health services, and really for anyone working with children and young people who have either PTSD or complex PTSD. And like other presenters, I'll share the link to the tables at the end of the presentation. And we hope that this will better inform the commissioning process of appropriate therapies, inform our knowledge and skills framework, offer evidence-based treatment choices to service users, help inform workforce planning, inform the supervision needs of practitioners, and also inform workforce sustainability. And this work will also feed into and inform the development of future national trauma outcome measures for children and young people. So the development of the Matrix Plant evidence tables was driven by a small task and finish group led by Professor Bisson and with oversight from the Matrix Cymru leadership team. And I have to say thank you to Neil Roberts and Liz Andrews, and also to Andrea Gray from Improvement Cymru for their input. The existing published evidence for the treatment of PTSD in children and young people was appraised according to the quality of the research evidence and the treatment efficacy. So the document consists of 2 tables that focus on the prevention of PTSD and the treatment of PTSD in children and young people. And as Neil has already explained, complex PTSD is a relatively new diagnosis, and the research base in this age group is only emerging. So we've adopted a pragmatic approach towards providing recommendations for treatment of CPTSD in children and young people. And that's in the narrative of the document. In time, as new high quality evidence emerges, the document and the recommendations will be adjusted to reflect the growing evidence base, and as such the tables may be viewed as live. And in addition to the tables, there is an important narrative section in the document that embraces the fundamental principles of the matrix plant approach and ethos. When assessing children and young people, for example, it's extremely important to take a developmentally informed, attachment-informed approach. Working with families, parents and carers, and with the systems around the child is key, and our approach needs to be flexible and adapt to the diverse needs of the infant, child or young person. And this can often be creative, curious, compassionate, empathetic and playful. So coming to the two tables, looking at preventing PTSD, there is actually quite little or scant research evidence currently available. We do not currently recommend single session debriefing, as two small RCTs of low to moderate quality suggested no significant effect on PTSD symptoms after a single session of debriefing compared to treatment as usual. In the table, we have recommended a psychosocial early intervention called the Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, or the CTTSI, and this achieves a grade B for evidence and for efficacy. And this approach focuses on both poor social or familial support and poor coping skills in the immediate aftermath of a potentially traumatic event. But we also recommend in the narrative general approaches that are practical, compassionate and pragmatic, and a period of monitoring after the first month after a trauma. So now looking at the recommendations for the treatment of PTSD in children and young people, I will briefly describe the two psychotherapeutic approaches that achieve a grade A for evidence and A for efficacy. So TFCBT is a trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, talking therapy, and it has a high level of published research evidence and a high level of treatment efficacy. And very briefly, it is a joint parent-child treatment that uses cognitive behavioural principles and exposure techniques to prevent and treat post-traumatic stress symptoms. And moving on to EMDR. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and this is what's called an integrative psychotherapy. And it also has a high level of published evidence and a high level of treatment efficacy. And EMDR helps to process and recover from past traumatic experiences that affect mental health and well-being. It's highly structured. It's not a form of hypnosis, and bilateral stimulation, for example, using side-to-side eye movements, are combined with a structured talking therapy, and it can help process traumatic memories that are stuck and help with natural healing and recovery. And in the matrix plant document narrative, we've also referenced large studies that are currently underway involving other psychotherapeutic approaches, and we've also referenced other emerging areas of interest. And this is the table, how it looks, which gives you the summary of the psychotherapeutic approaches that are recommended for treating PTSD in children and young people. So coming on to the treatment of complex PTSD, due to the lack of current available research evidence, we suggest that the first line that we're recommending for PTSD in children and young people is also used. But in complex PTSD, we need to consider the disorders of self-organisation, which John described earlier, and which can affect affect regulation, which can create a negative self-concept and disturbances in relationships. Therefore, longer courses of treatment needed. And it may also be helpful to consider the need for stabilisation-focused intervention for a child or young person with complex PTSD. And by stabilisation, this encompasses things like grounding techniques, resourcing, psychoeducation, affect regulation, and coping skills, so that a child or young person is better able to engage with the trauma therapy. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being involved in the development of the tables and also presenting this morning. And I've included the link to the matrix tables.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. And just to say that we've pasted that up, so at 11:40 the link to the tables went into the chat, so you should be able to link into that. Great, so we're now going to move on to our final presentation of the morning, which will allow us some good time for a question and answer session at the end. And it's a pleasure to welcome Matt Hoskins, who's consultant psychiatrist with Traumatic Stress Wales, recently appointed and took up the position, having been working in an interim role before that. And Matt's going to talk about the pharmacological treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. As you know, we're very keen to harness the complementarity of the social, the psychological, and the biological factors and approaches within people who are affected by traumatic events. And so this is the final bit of the jigsaw for this morning. So Matt, hopefully you're there, and if I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much, John. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for staying for this talk. So I'm a consultant psychiatrist working 50% with Traumatic Stress Wales, and I offer a few sessions to the clinic in Cardiff and then to Cumtat in Swansea Bay as well. The other half of my week, I'm the consultant psychiatrist for our psychiatric intensive care units in Havanacoid in Cardiff. I've also got a research interest, so I'm the principal investigator for an upcoming phase 2 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted therapy for severe PTSD, which is sponsored by an American organization called MAPS, and we're hopefully starting that around April, May of 2022. But today I'm going to talk to you about pharmacotherapy, or medications that we use in PTSD. And what I'll cover in the next 50 minutes or so is how we know that these medications work, so the evidence base for them, when we use them in terms of being before, during, or after therapy, and then how we use them in terms of the best route to prescribe them using something we put together called the Cardiff prescribing algorithm for PTSD. So first, I'll just explain some of the research that we've done here in Cardiff that was commissioned by first the World Health Organization and then the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, which was a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Now, this is a type of research where you systematically search for and then critically appraise and then extract data from randomized controlled trials of medications that have been published or sometimes unpublished. And this flow diagram shows the number of records that we identified in the most recent series of meta-analyses. And the bottom box shows the number of studies that we included that we could extract some meaningful data from. And when we were looking at randomized controlled trials for PTSD, we split things up into randomized controlled trials that were comparing a drug of interest versus a placebo or an inactive pill that looks and appears in all ways much like the drug of interest. Then we looked at augmentation studies. This is where the participants are split up into two groups. Group A would be on drug A plus drug B, and the second group would be on drug A plus a placebo. So you're really looking at the effects of drug B. And then we looked at drug-assisted therapies, and that's where some of the exciting evidence of MDMA-assisted therapy came out. And then we also looked at drugs versus drugs with no placebo group. And then we looked at drugs versus therapies. And the primary outcome that we were interested in was reduction in overall PTSD symptoms as they were assessed on a clinician-rated scale called CAPS, if that was available. So I'm going to explain this slide, but this is just to give you an example of how the data looked when we were extracting it and analyzing it. So this is an example of the data that we found for the drug paroxetine, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And this is called a meta-analysis forest plot. If you look to the left, you can see there's a few different names: Marshall 2001, 2007, SKB 627, and Tucker. Those are the names of the individual studies. The several columns of data, the raw data that we could extract from the paper, so the changes in PTSD symptoms before and after for each group, and then the chart with the green and black lines, that is the forest plot. And each green box correlates to the numbers of participants rather, that were involved in the study. So a big green box is a bigger study, a small green box is a smaller study. And the black line that emanates from the green box is the confidence interval. So that's the confidence range that we have to say the true effect of the drug probably lies within it. So a better confidence interval is one that's tighter to the green box. And the black diamond at the bottom, that's the statistical analysis of all the studies combined. So if that black triangle is on the left side of the vertical line, that means there's a statistical significant difference between the drug and the placebo. So here we can see that black diamond is quite far away from the line, which means placebo was statistically different. Paroxetine was statistically different to placebo, and that drug is effective in reducing PTSD symptoms. So what we found from our monotherapy systematic review and meta-analysis is that there's really good evidence to recommend these following drugs. The first three, paroxetine, sertraline, and fluoxetine, are all from the same drug family called the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And these are drugs which are quite commonly prescribed in primary care by GPs, but also by psychiatrists as well. The fourth drug is venlafaxine. This is another antidepressant in a different family called the serotonin noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors. And this is one which is more usually initiated by a psychiatrist. The fourth drug is quetiapine, and this is actually an antipsychotic mood stabilizing medication that we use in conditions that can vary quite a lot. Primarily, we use them in psychotic conditions such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but we also use quetiapine to boost the effect of antidepressants in depression. We sometimes use them in anxiety conditions. And from our research, we found that you can prescribe quetiapine and it can have a good effect on reducing PTSD symptoms overall. We also found that there were single small randomized controlled trials which did show that amitriptyline, mirtazapine, and phenelzine, three antidepressants, were also superior to placebo. But because the studies were so small and because there was only one of each, there wasn't enough information there for us to meta-analyze it and to recommend these as having the same strength of evidence as the aforementioned drugs. There were many studies which showed that the drug didn't outperform placebo. There was no statistical significance. And what's interesting here is a number of these drugs are in the same family as the SSRI ones that we recommended, such as escitalopram and citalopram. And also another antipsychotic there, olanzapine, is in the same modern class of antipsychotics as quetiapine, but interestingly didn't show that it was more effective than placebo in one small study. So this suggests to us that you can't simply recommend a class of medications as being effective for PTSD. We really have to say the evidence-based ones are the specific ones from the previous slide. Also, interestingly, there were some drugs which we could not find clinical trial evidence of being investigated, such as trazodone, melatonin, and others. And these are medications which we sometimes may prescribe in patients with PTSD, but at the moment, no clinical trial evidence exists for them. Moving on, the second significant systematic review and meta-analysis we did was looking at randomized randomized controlled trials that looked at augmentation strategies. Now, this is where you might be on a medication A, and then a medication B is added into it, and you want to see how effective medication B was. So in these sorts of studies, you would compare that to another control group where you would be already taking medication A, and you would add a placebo to medication A, and you'd be able to compare the placebo to medication B. Of the augmentation strategies that had evidence, we found that 2 drugs could be recommended, and these were prazosin and risperidone. So prazosin is not actually a mental health medication. It's actually a medication used in physical health conditions such as heart problems like high blood pressure, also in prostate problems. But prazosin was found to have a very interesting effect on reducing overall PTSD symptom severity, whilst also having a specific effect on reducing the severity and intensity of PTSD-related nightmares. Risperidone is an antipsychotic that's in the same modern family as quetiapine, but risperidone is thought to be the most old-fashioned of the newer generation antipsychotics. So some of the side effects of risperidone can be more troublesome than quetiapine. So the things for us to consider so far are when to use medications. As we know with post-traumatic stress disorder, the first-line treatments should be trauma-focused psychological therapies. Sometimes patients may not be able to access, or they may not be able to tolerate trauma-focused therapies. And for those patients, medications might be appropriate to prescribe first. Some patients may prefer not to engage in a trauma therapy, and medication may be their preference. And in clinical practice, what we do find quite often is that the waiting list to access a trauma-focused therapy can sometimes be quite long. And a humane approach in the interim, if someone has significant symptoms and they're on a waiting list to start some therapy, is to actually discuss with them the benefits and risks of medication to see if it might be appropriate to start a medication whilst they're on the waiting list, and then probably continue until they've finished their therapy. The other thing to consider is that there's just a handful of medications that we can recommend, and they do have a small positive effect on PTSD symptoms, but they're not going to put someone into remission, just through medication. Oftentimes, medication is going to be a complement to psychological therapies. The other thing for us to consider is with further research, are we going to find medications that are going to be significantly better than what we already have? And my opinion is that more medications might be added to the armory in terms of having access to more evidence-based medications with further research in the future. But I'm skeptical that a medication that already exists that's prescribed for other conditions might come and be significantly more effective. And the other thing for us to consider then is prazosin and when to use that, with it being found to have a significant effect on PTSD-related nightmares. I think there's a case to be made if someone's on a long waiting list with clinically significant nightmares, for them to have a trial of prazosin to see if it can help reduce their symptoms. And I think there's a case to be made when someone has maybe come to the end of a course of psychological therapy, if they're still having problematic nightmares at that point, residual symptoms, then a course of prazosin would be sensible as well. But I think the benefits and risks of prazosin should be discussed with patients when they're seeing their doctors to see if it's the right time for them to give that medication a go. So off the back of the research that we've done, Prof. Bisson with some medical students from Cardiff University helped put together a prescribing algorithm which will aid primary and secondary care doctors, so GPs and psychiatrists, in having discussions with patients around the evidence for medications and choosing which ones to use. So this is one of the images from the Cardiff prescribing algorithm, which shows that the very first thing that should be done is always to have a very open discussion about the medications, including their common, notable, and serious side effects, as well as possible problems that can emerge if a medication is used alongside something it may interact with, as well as problems that can emerge if someone's taken a medication and then suddenly stops it. So medications like paroxetine can cause problems if they're stopped very suddenly, and these are called discontinuation symptoms. So it's really important to always have that conversation with patients. And then the first-line medications that we would recommend using the algorithm are the SSRI medications, fluoxetine, paroxetine, and sertraline, and these are commonly prescribed by GPs. And we give examples of starting doses, how often someone should be reviewed, and target maximum doses for each medication. From the clinical research that we've done, it would suggest that aiming for the maximum dose will probably give the maximum benefit to patients. Unfortunately, patients often don't benefit from may not tried, or they may have significant side effects and may wish to an alternative. So the second part of the algorithm is what to do as a second line or a third line. The second line, if the first SSRI that's tried, if that isn't working or isn't tolerated, is to swap to one of the other SSRIs, or to consider swapping to venlafaxine. Now, some GPs are happy to prescribe venlafaxine, but some GPs would prefer this to be initiated in secondary care by a psychiatrist, because one of the problems with venlafaxine is that it can cause increases in blood pressure that go up every time the dose is increased. If the SSRI and maybe a second or third SSRI and maybe venlafaxine haven't been tolerated or aren't effective, then a third step could be to reduce and stop them, and to start the quetiapine medication. With quetiapine being an antipsychotic and having more significant side effects, it's really important that the patient has appropriate baseline investigations, including heart tracing or ECG, and some baseline metabolic blood tests done before this is started. If, however, the SSRI or venlafaxine have been found to be effective and tolerated, then a follow-up step could be augmentation, so adding another drug to make them more effective. And these drugs could be either quetiapine or prazosin for either step. Unfortunately, some patients may have been through these first, second, and third lines and are still showing significant symptoms, or they haven't been able to tolerate them. And it's at that stage that we'd recommend those three medications that have less evidence in terms of their effectiveness. And these were the ones that just had single studies that showed they were superior to placebo. And these medications would be the antidepressants, amitriptyline, mirtazapine, and phenelzine. So within the algorithm, there are some further detailed notes to help clinicians discuss and plan out treatment plans with patients. And these would be around ensuring that if someone's already taken a medication that's not an evidence-based one for PTSD, that this is reduced and stopped before the recommended medication is started. We've discussed adding in quetiapine that can be for marked agitation. An old-fashioned name for quetiapine is that it's a major tranquilizer, so it can help to soften the edges of agitation in particular. We also recommend the use of trazodone and mirtazapine, with trazodone being a medication that's an antidepressant, with the main side effect being sedation, and mirtazapine being another antidepressant with a side effect of sedation that does have evidence for helping with PTSD. And we recommend these two medications because sleep disturbances are characteristic symptoms with PTSD, and we would like to try to avoid people using some of the addictive and habit-forming medications for chronic sleep problems, such as benzodiazepines, temazepam or diazepam, and some of the Z medications like zopiclone. If we can avoid using those long-term, that's better. Within the algorithm notes as well, we have detailed tables looking at the side effects for different medications so that patients can make an informed choice and pick one which would suit them best. We also warn that when discussing medications with patients that a detailed drug history is taken, and that patients know they should avoid potential drugs being prescribed in the future that can interact with some of the antidepressants. In particular, antidepressants act on the serotonin systems in the brain. And if you take other medications that also act on the serotonin systems in the brain, such as herbal remedies like St. John's wort or strong painkillers like pethidine or tramadol, this can increase the risk of something called serotonin syndrome, which can be a potentially serious reaction. And we also give a detailed prescribing initiation guide for prazosin, because this is a medication which is not commonly prescribed by psychiatrists or indeed GPs, because it's quite old-fashioned. Prof. Bisson had extracted an initiation guideline from some of the research studies that can be followed, and we found as being well tolerated in the majority of patients. So this is the common adverse effects or side effects table, detailing some common problems you can have with the medications, with a negative sign showing that it's not present or neutral, and a positive sign showing that it is present, with 3 positives showing that it is significant and can be expected in most people. We can see there sertraline has some of the lowest common adverse effects, with amitriptyline, a very old-fashioned antidepressant, having some of the most problematic side effects of any medication. We also include information in the algorithm around monitoring requirements. So in particular, antidepressant medications like the SSRIs and the SNRIs have been reported to increase the risk of suicidal thoughts or acts, especially in young people aged 18 to 24, and especially when they're first started. So this is a rare side effect, which is the opposite of the effect that we see in most people in terms of reducing suicidal thoughts. So we warn that if suicidal thoughts are present prior to starting these sorts of medications, then a patient starting them should be monitored on a regular weekly basis to be able to look out if these rare side effects are emerging. With venlafaxine, as I mentioned earlier, it can increase your blood pressure, so we recommend blood pressures monitored when just before you first start, and then after every significant change of dose, and then annually. With quetiapine, we recommend a heart tracing is done beforehand, as well as a full set of metabolic bloods, and these should be repeated during the course of treatment as well. And that is just coming up to the end of my talk. If you'd like to access the Cardiff algorithm, all you have to do is pop in Cardiff Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Prescribing Algorithm into your search engine of choice, and you'll find a downloadable PDF. And this is shared with all the health boards in Wales. Many thanks.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt, for that. Yeah. Very helpful overview of pharmacological treatments. So hopefully that's given everybody a flavour of what we're doing within Traumatic Stress Wales. There are a few questions coming through, and please do type any additional questions that you've got. Sadly, we can't sort of hear you if you ask the questions verbally, but if you type them in, we'll read them out. So I'm going to ask all of the members of the panel who presented this morning, maybe if they can show their faces and put their videos back on, and then we can start going through the questions together. So there's been several coming in, and I'll just bring those up while people are joining. Fantastic. Always a relief to see that people are still out there at this juncture, so thank you for that. So just running through the questions, and please do, colleagues, feel free to sort of jump in if you'd like to, and perhaps I'll direct certain questions to certain people if that's all right as well. We had a question from Priya Vara about the link to the specification document. So in the background, we've been frantically trying to identify the link, but I haven't got access to the right one at the moment. So we'll make sure that we do provide people with access to that, and we'll make sure there's a link that's accessible from our website for that document as well. So the next set of questions were from Maya Badham. Was just wondering what the speakers think of using trauma-informed theory and practice, such as the power threat meaning framework, reframing trauma symptoms as trauma responses, and these trauma responses as rational, valid, understandable, etc. So just wondering if anybody would like to pick that one up and maybe talk to that initially. I don't know, Claire, would you have any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's something we're very aware of, and you know, it's a fantastic piece of you know, work, and I think it's been really good in sort of highlighting and to kind of shape those conversations, which is brilliant. And hopefully the work that I've presented kind of really reflects that move, that we understand that people present with the impacts of trauma in a whole range of settings, and sort of thinking about how we respond in those principles of trauma-informed and trauma-enhanced practice. I think though that we were told that actually it's a continuum, and that some people will be likely to benefit from specific trauma-focused therapies, and some people do find a diagnosis of PTSD really really helpful. So in terms of sort of accessing appropriate treatments and care, and sort of identifying and you know, sort of yes, sort of identifying the kind of the trauma-related difficulties that that people present with. So I think yeah, I mean, it's fantastic, and you know, it's really exciting. I think all the developments that are going on. So hopefully our pathway does reflect that continuum of approaches.
No, thanks, Claire. And you know, personally, I think it's a very important point, and I think as we're, you know, as you can hopefully see, we're trying to sort of get the right sort of combination between the sociological, the psychological, and the biological. We're working, and a follow-up point that Maya had was around, I'd like to hear the views on adverse childhood experiences as not being truly trauma-informed. So a piece of work we're doing at the moment with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Hub in Wales is trying to develop a framework for trauma-informed practice and organisations, etc., that makes sense to everybody really, right across the spectrum. And that's a challenging piece of work, and we're having quite in-depth discussions. We certainly don't want to go down you know, a medical model or a medical way of working, but we do want to acknowledge that there are times when actually a degree of medical input in a trauma-informed manner may be helpful to some people. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on getting that in. A question that Maya and several other people had was around involving different people in different groups and the work we're doing. And I think that we've got, you know, one thing we have tried to do, and I think we've achieved to a significant degree, is being inclusive of getting people involved. Clearly, we haven't got everybody involved yet, and it's great to see people wanting to become involved through the chat, and I'm sure we'll take people up on that. But Tom, I was wondering if you're there, whether you'd like to talk about sort of how we're engaging with people from different sectors with the work that you're involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, John. So, and I did see a couple of people mentioning in the chat there that you know, there might be other I mean, well, for sure there will be other third sector organisations that will be really interested in kind of speaking to, and I mean, I suppose as far as, you know, for example, in the refugee and asylum seeker work stream, we're trying to kind of have you know, sort of have a group which is, you know, as inclusive as possible, but still keeping the group fairly focused on being able to you know, achieve outcomes really, and achieve deliverables. And you know, what we're really trying to do is have representation on that group from organisations across the whole of Wales, to make sure that you know, if there is you know, a particular person in a particular organisation, you know, in an area of Wales that we can kind of link people into locally, I think that's a really important you know, important consideration to have. So you know, I'm more than happy to pick that up with people, and if you know, if anyone's got any specific questions about, you know, who's active in, you know, either in children and young people services or refugee and asylum seeker services, I'm more than happy to, you know, have a conversation, pick that up and have a conversation, email conversation around that. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies it a little bit.
No, thank you, Tom. And I think that's true for all of our groups. And picking up on some of the specific groups that been mentioned, then we do have members from a lot of members actually from the third sector on lots of our groups and making very, very valuable contributions. I noticed in the chat as well that Anne Hubbard, who's Director of Wales Strategic Migration Partnership and also the chair of our work stream for refugees and asylum seekers, has been, emphasising that point that we are including people and encouraging people to get involved. So then the next question that I came up with was, is anything happening in North Wales? I don't know if anybody would like to talk to North Wales on the panel. Claire, you're I don't know whether that's one that you could talk to a bit about that. I can certainly update on the psychiatry input in North Wales, but maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So North Wales, Nick Horn is now our in post as our Traumatic Stress Wales lead, which is fantastic. And so we're yeah, just fully engaged with that, and there's some fantastic work that's going on, I know, particularly within North Wales. And so yeah, absolutely involved in our networks and really kind of keen to make sure that it is truly all Wales. And we know that there are some barriers in terms of kind of geographical issues, and we don't kind of want there to sort of be silos within Wales, and we want there to kind of be sharing of good practice across the region. So very, very excited to have the involvement from North Wales. And yeah, I mean, if you wanted specifically to kind of link in with people in North Wales, then if you wanted to kind of email us or contact us, then we can put you in the direction of people who are locally embedded.
Thanks, Claire, and it's great to see Nick adding to the chat. That's me. Hello. So, Nick, yeah. You may well get some emails coming your way from this discussion. Thanks for putting your head above the parapet, as it were. And I mean, within every health board within Wales, then every health board now has a lead who's working closely with Traumatic Stress Wales and really developing, developing a plan within their local area and helping to, improve the health and well-being of people locally. As I said before, everybody's doing things in a slightly different way, which we think is appropriate. And I know in North Wales, as in other areas, now they've also just appointed a consultant psychiatrist to take on some sessional input to the development of work there as well. So we're in exciting times, and I think that over the next year then we'll be seeing a lot more going on a local basis, as several people, not least Nick, have only just come into post. So then, yeah, the next one was around sort of training and safety and stabilisation training, which I think we've covered to a degree. I thought there was a lovely comment from Bethan Wood in the chat. I love how you're already thinking about embedding this training in a variety of settings, organisations. I think for a long time trauma has been seen as psychology's job, but really it's everybody's business. Staff working in areas other than psychology need the protected time and space to increase their confidence in putting this type of training to use. So I definitely think that that's a mantra that we're very keen to sort of roll out, really, that this is everybody's business, and it's only by working together that we'll be able to really move things forward. So is there a route for Traumatic Stress Wales members to see who is involved? So I did put up something about that, to communicate and share information. We're very keen to develop a network, an All Wales network that people can get involved in, and that's something that we will be developing, Jane, over, well, I mean, I think we should be getting on with that. There are clearly some data protection issues that we'll need to look into and be careful about that, but watch this space. And I mean, certainly now that you've all sort of registered with us, we'll email you at some juncture and ask if you would like to be part of that. And as long as you give us permission, then we'll make sure that you are. Mark Burkill, hello Mark, was talking about Matrix, Cymru, and perhaps a feeling of a focus on clinical psychologists. And Neil's very kindly agreed to sort of look into that and deal with that one outside. I don't know, Neil, whether you'd like to say anything more to that.
Probably not, John. I guess my role within MCLIP is really been kind of in this editorial role, and I perhaps need to take that elsewhere, really.
No, sure, absolutely, yeah. And then, yeah, moving on to some more specific questions. Matt, here's one for you. It would be helpful to hear more about developments with psychoactive substances, MDMA, alongside therapeutic interventions from Melody Cranbourne-Rosser.
Sure. So I've just shared a link to Melody of a talk I did for the ECMP earlier this year, I think it was. But essentially where we are at the moment, we're signing contracts in order to obtain a home office license. And once we have that in place, we should be starting on a phase 2 open label MDMA assisted therapy study in Cardiff, treating 4 participants initially. But as soon as we've started, where our sponsors got funding secured to move seamlessly into phase 3, and we're part of a European-wide group of sites. So I think about 16 sites all across Europe who are doing the same protocol, phase 2 and phase 3. So I imagine within the next 5 years, we should have both of those studies completed, and provided the evidence suggests that MDMA is safe and effective, then the next steps would be around changing the law really to reschedule MDMA so it could become a prescribed medication for severe PTSD and CPTSD in the future.
Thanks, Matt. And I mean, as people are probably aware, things are moving along at pace, certainly in the United States at the moment in this regard. And yes, well, I mean, Matt, I'm sure that you'll be keen to sort of put information up on our website when more information becomes available and with results and advances. So that's great. Tanya Bageli asks, is there any consideration within traumatic stress wells for developing expertise in climate-related trauma, flooding to their house, farmers losing livestock, etc.? I mean, this is a really important point, and within disaster planning, certainly, there's been a real shift, certainly from when I first got involved, from thinking about sort of the Big Bang traumatic event to more sort of the climate-related traumas, which often have, you know, sort of longer follow-throughs. Thinking of, you know, research done around the floodings in Somerset, for example, and the real prolonged periods that people had to stay away from their homes, etc. So I think it's a very good point. I don't know if any colleagues are aware of anybody working in this area in Wales at the moment. I saw that Tanya has put up a link on the website, I think. Tanya sort of said something. I thought I saw a link from somebody else. I have. Yeah, Tanya Dolly has put a link up around Climate Psychology Alliance. But again, if people are interested in this, then please do make contact, and we can set up and have a chat about it. Then from Cara Lauver, I used the developmental trauma model following on from some excellent training with Beacon House. They championed the neurosequential model of therapeutics by Perry, working from a bottom-up approach through the brain, noticing differences at the primitive, limbical and cortical brain. I have to confess I'm not totally familiar with that model. I don't know if anybody else on the panel is familiar with it. Siobhan, you're nodding. Fantastic.
Yes, very, very familiar, Cara, with Bruce Perry's work, and very much sort of apply it in my own clinical practice, that bottom up approach. And when we created the narrative in the Matrix Plant document, we held in mind the Bessel, not only Bruce Perry, but Bessel van der Kolk's work, Dan Hughes's PACE model, and also the window of tolerance, so the Porges work as well. So although those models aren't actually in the evidence tables because of the way that we categorize the quality of the evidence, we very much held those principles in mind. And I hope, you know, in my presentation, I talked about the importance of taking a developmentally informed and attachment informed approach, working with systems, working with parents and carers as a vital sort of skill set, if you like, in working with traumatized infants, children and young people.
Thanks, Siobhan. That's great. So we're at 12:30. I mean, I suggest that we close on time, and I think we are through the questions. It's great to see in the chat a lot of networking going on, particularly in North Wales at the moment. So please do continue that, and we'll be in contact with you as soon as things go up on our website, and look forward to, hopefully working with everybody in the future to, achieve our mission. So thanks very much, everybody, for attending, and I'm going to draw the meeting to a close there. Have a good day. Thank you.